Okay, let's dive into 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Now, before we dive in there, we need to kind of set the stage a little bit for this one because the Corinthian correspondence is a little bit different. One of the things that we often hear about Corinth as a city was that it was so morally corrupt that that's just they were living in a terrible, just completely immoral place. Now, it's not wholly untrue, but we do need to make some distinction here. Now, Corinth is located on an isthmus there, and it connects the Peloponnese with the Greek homeland there. It's right there and is situated in a way to control north and south trade, so there's a lot coming through there. And it's also about a mile west from the Lycaeum, the port of Lycaeum, so a mile to the north there. So it is well situated, and there's going to be a lot of things coming through there. So that's part of what we go. But one of the things that often gets overlooked is that there are actually 2 Corinths. One is the ancient city of Corinth, and this was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC. It is destroyed by there. The people are either killed or sold into slavery, right? That it's done. But we know that Julius Caesar founds the new city of Corinth, and by 29 BC, so a little over a century later, by 29 BC, Corinth is a senatorial, is a seat of a proconsul and a senatorial capital for the province of Achaia. Now, what's different now about this new Corinth as well, because if everybody has either been killed or sold into slavery from the old Corinth, this is a city that is primarily populated by Romans. Many retired soldiers made there. And Strabo tells us that many freedmen, these are just a step above slaves, they make their way to Corinth, so that's kind of your population. We know that there were some Jews there in Corinth, but it's primarily dominated by the Romans. What also is unique here about Corinth at this time is there is no landed aristocracy. No landed aristocracy at Rome. It's completely changed. This is going to be, the new aristocracy is going to be completely won by wealth. So there's where we got there. Now, this is where we get into, well, what about these characterizations of Corinth? We know that the old Corinth had a reputation for immorality and licentiousness. There's no doubt about that. That's where the phrase to Corinthianize, to fornicate, or calling someone a Corinthian woman was a slanderous term. That's where that comes from. Strabo's description of there being 1,000 temple prostitutes, that's almost assuredly an exaggeration. So we have to be careful not to read the old Corinth onto the new Corinth. Now, that's not to say that this new Corinth was by any means a morally virtuous place. That's not what we're dealing with. We can't say for sure how much of old Corinth's morals carried over into new Corinth. We can say there's not a time in Roman civilization where they're fully looked at as morally virtuous. But to say just because it's Corinth it was the most licentious place in the empire is overstating the thing. Now, again, there's a lot of trade coming through. There's a lot of, undoubtedly, there is some prostitution, but that's happening at other places too. So we just want to be careful not to overstate what we can historically be certain of. Now, when we talk about the Corinthian correspondence, here's one of the big issues we have. Paul actually wrote 4 letters to the church at Corinth, right? You often hear this referred to as Corinthians A through D. Okay? A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4. We know that 1 Corinthians is actually Corinthians B, and 2 Corinthians is Corinthians D. If Paul wrote after that, we don't have anything existing there. So we know that that's there. And so one of the beautiful things is while Paul is undisputedly the author, one of the things we see is this is a sustained conversation with the church at Corinth. He's having this conversation over the course of years. And he's built a relationship with the church. He's having these conversations with them, again, over time. So it's a really interesting way to see things. Now, we know that Paul first came to Corinth on a second missionary journey. You can see Acts chapter 18. He comes there. He supports himself with Aquila and Priscilla. That's where we meet them, chapter 18, verses 1 through 3. But when Timothy and Silas join Paul from Thessalonica, he devotes himself fully to the preaching of the word. That's Acts chapter 18, and 18 verse 5. And then we see that Paul then spends 18 months there establishing the church in Corinth. In fact, the only church we know Paul had a longer time with in person would be the church at Ephesus. There. So we know Paul has a lot of time here invested in this church, invested in these people. So we're talking here, he's there in Corinth. We know he leaves Corinth by ship probably sometime around AD 51. He leaves Corinth by ship, headed for Jerusalem. Actually crosses over into Ephesus, then to Jerusalem. And then we know he returns to Antioch before going to Ephesus and having a fruitful ministry of about 2.5 years, sometime between AD 52 and AD 55 there in Ephesus. And it's during this period that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians or Corinthians B. So we're talking somewhere, Paul's writing this letter sometime around AD 55. That's a good guess. I mean, it could have been late in AD 54, but we're just going to put 55. That seems like a good time for it. But one of the things we have to see is what is bringing this about? What's the occasion for this? Well, if we turn over to 1 Corinthians 5, and in verse 9, Paul says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. So he's pointing back to the true 1 Corinthians or Corinthians A. We don't know exactly when he wrote this. It seemed it's going to probably, if I had to guess, I'd put somewhere between 52 to 53 in there. Give him time to write the letter, get them time to receive it, and then get them time to misunderstand it and just sort of the whole thing to go in there. That's kind of where we're guessing. But he wrote them a letter, and it included these instructions about association with immoral people, and again, how they misunderstood it. Now, what we have to see here is that we don't know what else may be in there. There may be a number of issues throughout Corinthians B here that Paul has addressed. We just don't know for sure because we don't have this document there. So we know that that's part of what's causing him to write this second letter. The second thing, we see chapter 1, verse 11, that people from Chloe's household have come. Now, exactly who these people are, what they bring, well, we know that they're telling us that people from Chloe's household is what we assume, how we translate that. That these people are coming and they're telling Paul that there's a lot of strife in Corinth. What else they tell him, we can't exactly be sure, but it definitely seems that there's time there. We know that in this time also that they've written to Paul because he goes in 1 Corinthians chapter 17, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. So Paul writes the letter and it has time for them to write a letter. People from Chloe's household do that. And it's possible, it's possible, though not confirmed, that as we see in 1 Corinthians 16, 17, that with Stephanos, Fortunatus, and Achaicus bringing the gift of support from Corinth, that they brought the letter, though he doesn't say that. So there are a number of things back and forth with this church. We know that the situation has formed with factions there in 1 Corinthians. Apollo and Peter have visited this church and have ministered there, but there's no evidence that these two are the source of those factions, or that these two encourage these factions, or that they had anything to do with it. So that's sort of what we've got going on here in Corinth. A very interesting church, a lot of things back and forth with Paul in his ministry. Now, a couple of the things that we have, obviously, we get this introduction, but then chapters 1 from 110 to 421 are all about divisions in the church. Paul is very concerned about these divisions. So this first major section, he's focusing on divisions, and we'll talk about that as one of Paul's major themes. But then in there we get a case of, after that we get a case of incest, a case of litigation, and a case of sexual immorality. And then Paul talks generally about sexual immorality. So we do know that the church is struggling with this issue. But also we see in chapter 7 they're struggling with the marriage issue. We'll definitely deal with some of that. He's not there. And we'll see that this is a big issue for them. They're struggling with food, sacrifice to idol, and Christian liberty. Chapters 8 through 11. Then we get that head coverings passions in chapter 11, 2 through 16 that we have to deal with. Paul gives them instructions about the Lord's Supper. He talks about spiritual gifts, one of the major sections, chapters 12, 1 through the end of chapter 14. Then he gives this beautiful chapter, one of the crowning chapters in all of Scripture, on the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ in chapter 15. In chapter 16, he talking about the collection he hopes to do. He exhorts them, and then he sends them final greetings. So there are a lot of things going on in this letter, a lot of pieces we have to kind of work through as we engage this text. Now, before we can get to some of the major themes here, one of the things that we have to deal with are some issues in 1 Corinthians. One of the biggest issues that we need to deal with, well, just understanding Paul's rhetoric. Okay, Paul's rhetoric in 1 Corinthians is very tight. You can look, if you look through chapter 1, really through the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2, it is a very tight, rhetorically precise argument. But it's also not meant to be flashy. It's meant to be tight and focused. But one of the things he does that often affects our readings of how we understand Paul's writings here is his use of slogans. Corinthian slogans particularly. Now this comes through specifically in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Now here's the issue with slogans. Paul is engaging in a thing called diatribe, where he'll put out a position, then he'll respond to it. He'll put out a position, and he responds to it. We see this in Paul's writing. The difficulty in Greek is there are no quotation marks. So they would know, they would hear it, they would say, oh yeah, that's what he's doing. We are going to have to do some work. So if you turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, specifically in verses 12 through 20, we're going to deal with some slogans, particularly 1, 2, 3, 4 uses of slogans in 1 Corinthians 6, and see how this shapes our understanding of what he's saying. Now, the first two are right there in verse 12. So, all things are lawful for me. That would be the slogan. The response would be, you see the adversative, but not all things are profitable. That's very clear. That makes sense. This is a diatribe. That is an absolute way of going for it. So the Corinthians were saying, all things are lawful for me. Paul says, but not all things are profitable. He goes again, all things are lawful for me. Corinthians, response Paul, but I will not be mastered by any. Now here's where most scholars agree. Verse 13 is actually one full slogan, or the first half of verse 13 is a slogan. Food is for the stomach, and stomach is for the food, but God will do away with both of them. That's the slogan. Then the response is, Paul's response is, yet the body is not for immorality, but for the Lord. So what they're saying is you get this kind of fatalism. Hey, food is for the stomach, stomach for the food. Well, my body, sexual desire, my body's for fulfillment of that sexual desire, just like my stomach is for the fulfillment of my desire for food. And Paul said, and then you get this kind of almost, if you read, but God will do away with both of them, it gets kind of this, that's a weird way of Paul doing that. That doesn't really sound Pauline there. But if you say, this is part of the thing, and he says, it's almost like they're saying, Food is for the stomach and stomach for food. That's just sort of the way this goes. And it doesn't matter because God's going to do away with them anyway, Paul. And Paul comes back to them and he says, yet the body is not for immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. And so he's redirecting their understanding, their very anthropology of who they are and what they're meant to do, that their bodies are not for immorality, but they belong to the Lord. Again, you can look at chapter 17 and verse 18. Here's the one we often miss. It starts with the word every, and a lot of I think translations miss this, and they add this word. You'll see it in italics. It's not actually in the text. The word other. Here's how without that addition, here's how this sounds. Every sin that a man commits is outside his body. Okay? That sounds like a quote, like a slogan, right? If you add the word other to kind of make it more readable, that actually kind of detracts. If you read, based on Paul's use of diatribe, verse 18, every sin that a man commits is outside the body, response, but the immoral man sins against his own body. And then, or do you not know? And so he continues on there. So that's one of the things that Paul does, and he uses slogans. If these are slogans, as I've suggested, I think there's a lot of scholarly evidence to think that those are. In fact, in a lot of ways, there's growing. It's more of a consensus at this point that that's what Paul's doing. Paul's pressing back on a sexual libertinism in Corinth. And not only that, it's one that has this dualistic understanding of the body. It's leading them to immorality. Like, well, it's just my body. It doesn't matter, so I can go do this. And that's not what Paul's about at all. Paul's really pushing hard against that. Now, the other one that I think actually helps us read chapter 7 a lot better is here in verse 1. Now concerning the things about which you wrote, and then if we read this next section as a quotation, or here's what the Corinthians wrote, then it actually helps frame chapter 7 slightly differently. Here's the thing that the Corinthians wrote. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. Well, okay. Then it seems that you have a sexual libertine faction there in Corinth that is absolutely going on toward a licentious lifestyle if they're not careful. But on the other hand, you have a response party that's really kind of addressing and trying to pointing themselves toward an ascetic movement, that we're going to withdraw from that. We're not going to engage in these things. We're going to deny ourselves all the pleasures and all the good things. And as Paul will say, you're denying yourselves within the marriage, the very thing that God has created it for. And, excuse me. So if we see chapter 7 that way, it does help us reframe it and understand it in light of what Paul is saying. So I think that's a good way of reading that. And I think it does help us make better sense of what Paul is saying there in chapter 7. The second thing that we need to look at, it actually is a large section there, specifically in chapters 8 through 11. And it's this issue of food sacrifice to idols. Now, here's where we have to be careful. One of the things that happens is that we want to read this passage on that issue and the passage in Romans on that issue and kind of merge them together. Paul is talking about some very specific things in Corinth, and he's also talking about some very specific things in 1 Corinthians. And just because he addresses the same issue, it doesn't mean that they're having the same... It's a similar issue, but it doesn't mean they're exactly the same. In Rome, it appears that the big thing that they have is basically they're slaughtering the meat and they're selling it in the open market. That's one thing. Paul says, just, okay, go for it, use your liberty. And while he's talking about liberty in 1 Corinthians, one of the issues appears to be that it's not merely buying that meat, It's actually going to some of these particular feasts that have been associated with these sacrifices. So in that period, if you sacrifice something and then you went on over here to celebrate a feast, this was all viewed as one act of worship, sacrificing to the deity and then eating with that deity in worship. And so it seems that Paul's actually addressing a different issue than he was in Rome. Again, we want to be careful, and what we want to make sure, and this is the reason why it's an issue, we want to make sure that we're actually addressing the issue in the text before we try to synthesize it with another text. And that's one of the things I see from time to time that really happens with that issue. We kind of want to read it and like, oh, it's just the same thing. No. Paul's very concerned, specifically here in Corinth, that it's not the eating of the meat, it's the context in which they're eating it and the fact that it would do damage to someone else's faith in a very particular way. So here's that one. And then the one everybody knows we have to talk about because it's there. It's this issue of head coverings. All right. This is where chapter 11, specifically when we talk about verses 2 on 2 to 16, we know we have a very difficult text. The text points us here to this issue of head coverings, and one of the things that we often have to deal with is, okay, how do we know, what do we do with this passage? Now, we can't just dismiss it because Paul is giving them this command, and he's telling them that there's a way that they're to order their lives in the church, and there's a way that they're to order their lives based on God's design. It does not say, now, again, when Paul says, well, any woman who prays without her head covered dishonors God, he does not say, again, Paul does not, you see those, and you see people just lose their mind, set their hair on fire. Paul does not say women can have no role in church. He does say, specifically in this context, that they can, if they were to pray, they are to do so with their head covered. What we have to be careful of is, one, overreading the text and saying, well, then that means it's an exclusion for all women at all time, because that's clearly not what Paul's saying. Paul's made the conditional, if they do this in this way, it's not appropriate. The converse being, if they did it in the appropriate way, it would be fine. Excuse me. So that's that issue. But also, what do we do with head coverings? How are we supposed to address this? The big tell here is that within Corinth is seen as the outside, right? There's this thing, verse 16, but if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. Corinth is the outlier in what they're practicing here, okay? And that's what's key to admit. So if you look around this ancient Near East, throughout the Mediterranean, all these churches, everybody else seems to understand that this is what's right and this is what's appropriate. Corinth is the outlier, okay? So when we sit there and like, well, what does that mean for us? Do we need to do head coverings in the same way? And again, they're probably talking something like a shawl. Does that mean that we need to do that? No. The cultural implications, this is how everybody else does this because this is that particular culture. We're going to have to take the next step of really coming in and saying, okay, what does this look like in our culture? And really, when you get down to the principles Paul's talking about, he's talking about it should be this should reflect God's purpose and design and order in the church. So if we kind of put this in modern lingo, just kind of take it to kind of furthest thing, this would be like somebody coming into our churches. A woman in that day, coming into church without her hair covered and praying without it, would be like us having a woman coming into our churches in a swimsuit. That's just not contextually appropriate. Like we know, whoa. Okay, again, we like to say come as you are, but maybe cover up a little bit on that one. And so I think that's where we would need to understand this more. And again, this is one of those issues that does get debated and it does get yanked out of context. But that's what is, I want to encourage you as you read this, read this particular issue, really dive into what Paul's saying and avoid the traps on that. Okay? So let's talk about some key issues, key themes. We've talked about these key issues, these kind of big ones that always get talked about. And let's talk about some themes in the book of 1 Corinthians. The first one, clearly, takes 4 chapters. It's got to be a theme. The issue of unity. That's chapters 1 through 4. This is a huge issue from Paul. It's all over that issue. Now, again, we want to make clear, there is no evidence that the people's names who are associated with this, Peter, Paul, or Apollos, had anything to do with these factions, that they had any kind of role in forming them or of encouraging them. So, right, just make sure that that's clear. But Paul sees, one of the things that Paul makes clear is he sees an essential unity between him and Apollos. He says, I planted, Apollos watered. Same mission, God gives the growth. And what he goes on, if you get down to chapter 3, Paul goes through this, and he just says, look, here's how we do this. If any man, he's warning about any man's work, but then he comes into verse 16. Do you not know that you, plural, that's you, plural, y'all, are the temple of God and the Spirit of God dwells in you? What Paul is warning them is, you are ones who are tearing apart the work of God. It's not us, it's you. So unity, the way Paul gets at this and the way Paul really pushes this home is really clear that he wants to make sure that the Corinthians are grounded together. They understand that they are a people together, united in their common faith. And that those who come along and serve, they are just that, servants. You are united in your faith and your faith and your trust in Jesus Christ, not in us. And so that's a huge issue for Paul. It takes up 4 chapters, lots of things to go on there. Next one, I don't think anybody's going to be surprised with this one. Sexual morality and marriage. Sexual morality and marriage is a huge issue there. Again, we have 2 extremes. And if you've ever been to a church, you're like, well, man, how do those 2 coexist? You can get 2 people on completely opposite ends of the spectrum there, and they can start going at it. So we have, in Corinth, it appears we have a sexual libertine party and a sexual ascetic party. Obviously, we have this man who's in a incestuous relationship with his mother-in-law, or not mother-in-law, I'm sorry, his stepmother. Everybody gets the ick on that one. And you can understand how that would kind of push people. Like they get that ick factor, and they're like, "Whoa, we're not going down that road." But what's interesting is Paul warns them in chapter 5 and again in chapter 6 that they have to take action because that man's presence, not treating this sin in that way, is causing a particular moral decay in their own fellowship. And so Paul's very concerned with that, and he wants to make sure that they don't continue down that path. And so on the other end, you've got people who are like within the confines of marriage, we're not going to have sexual relations. And Paul's like, what are you doing? Right? What in the world are you thinking? Some people even saying, well, we shouldn't get married. And Paul's like, no, that's not this either. So one of these things, unique things about Corinth is we do have both extremes. And Paul's telling us, don't be pulled by passions either way. We stand on the principle of here's how God has planned and designed it. So he gives us that. He gives us this big theme of Christian liberty. One of the biggest things about Christian liberty is he uses his own self-restraint as a model. He says, I did not take money. I could have, but I didn't. Now, we can debate about some of the issues that may have caused at Corinth there, but Paul says, look, I didn't want to be a burden. And he knew that within Corinth that there were a lot of people who would pass through and who would just basically peddle their skills for money. He didn't want to be that. He wanted the gospel to go. And so that's how he did it. He restrained his use of liberty. And when it comes to how he was concerned for them, and he was concerned for them and for their faith, that becomes the way that they should take their view of how they particularly deal with this issue of food sacrificed to idols. So that one's another big one there. And I don't think anybody's going to be surprised again. Another big one, spiritual gifts. If Paul dedicates a number of chapters to something, it's a big issue. Now, obviously, the Corinthians have a big penchant toward the ecstatic gifts, toward the ones that are going to put them front and center. This is something that's just kind of natural to human beings. There's something that wants to be that wants to be in the spotlight. Paul comes back, he's again pushing back on that and says, no. All spiritual gifts are necessary. And, you could even make the argument, there's some, when he says specifically desire those greater gifts, those gifts of teaching, of encouraging, of making sure people are there. Those ones like that, those are more important. Those ecstatic gifts, yes, those are good, but at the same time, prophecy, teaching, those are there. And again, when he talks about prophecy, that would be more in line with the understanding of prophetic speaking, particularly in proclaiming the word there. So we've got spiritual gifts there. One of the things he wants to show is that dependence and interdependence there in the church. That's why he uses that body metaphor again. You are a body. You are a people together. And if you don't keep that, you're going to have a really big problem. And then finally, it's a whole chapter, and it's this there. It's the resurrection. And we could say more broadly eschatology, like we saw in 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians. But really, we're talking about specifically the resurrection of the dead, particularly Christ's resurrection, and how that also points to our future resurrection. And he's highlighting this kind of problem of dualistic tendencies there from some, the resurrection of the body, we're not really all sure about that. And Paul's like, no, God has made us body and soul. We're a complex kind of unity of what we have. We're not just an encased soul that happens to be in a body. No, our embodiedness is part of God's design for us, and that's why when Jesus Christ is raised from that, it points to our future resurrection there. So he also says, look, as he'll make clear, without the resurrection, there is no gospel, there is no hope. Your faith is futile, and so there. So again, big themes, and I don't think it should surprise anyone. If you read through 1 Corinthians, these are major themes throughout that book. So we've got those. But now let's talk about 2 Corinthians, or Corinthians D. So Paul writes 1 Corinthians in AD 55. Again, we know that there's no serious debate about Pauline authorship of 2 Corinthians. But after sending this letter of 1 Corinthians, Paul intends to remain in Ephesus until Pentecost. So we're assuming early AD 55. And then he wants to travel to winter, perhaps travel to Corinth, perhaps winter there. That's what he says in chapter 16, verses 5 through 8. In the meantime, though, he sends Timothy to Corinth. You see this in chapter 16 and again in Acts chapter 19. But at some point after the writing and sending of this letter, at some point he changed his plan, and he planned to visit Corinth twice. Once on the way into Macedonia and once on his way back from Macedonia. So to go doom there and then back. We see this in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. If you flip over there, he says in verses 15 and 16, in this confidence, I intended at first to come to you so that you might twice receive a blessing. That is, to pass on your way into Macedonia, and again from Macedonia to come to you and be sent and helped on my journey to Judea. So he was going to go into Macedonia, come back out of them, and then on to Judea. Now, on his return visit, he was hoping to collect money for the believers in Jerusalem who were suffering famine and persecution at this time. This is something that happens a couple of times in the New Testament there. So that was Paul's plan. It kind of shifted there at some point. But when Timothy gets to Corinth, it just appears that the situation was too much for him to manage. 1 Corinthians or Corinthians B did not have the intended effect Paul was hoping for. It did not land the way he was hoping. It was troubled. It was problematic. So Paul immediately goes to Corinth. And if you turn to chapter 2, verse 1, I determined for my own sake that I would not come to you in sorrow again. This visit, we don't know exactly here, it's what's often known as the painful visit. There's a painful visit Paul has here. And one of the contributing factors around this time is the church is being taken over by some self-designated leaders. They're likely carried references for themselves as apostles, letters of recommendation. You see this in 2 Corinthians 11 and chapter 3. And as you can imagine, if he calls it a painful visit, it's not successful. It does not do what he was there. His opponents attacked him. And in fact, we can see in deeply offensive ways in sometimes. We see this in chapter 2 and chapter 7. And so Paul left and did not immediately return. In all likelihood, Paul takes a step back from the Corinthians and realizes he needs to come at this from another angle. We need to step back and we need to regroup. Now, some charged him with being fickle, as you can see right there in chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. That is, to pass you in. Therefore, I was not vacillating when I intended to come to you. What I purpose do I purpose in the flesh. Right? He's saying they're probably to just make, he's just fickle. He's coming here. He's going there. You should never know with Paul. That's what he does. So at some point there, in between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, or Corinthians B and D, Paul writes Corinthians C. Corinthians C is what's known as the tearful or severe letter. We get this referred to in verse 4 of chapter 2. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you with many tears, not that you would be made sorrowful, but that you might know the love which I have especially for you. So there's this problem we've got. We find out that this was delivered by Titus. And Paul demanded the punishment of the leader who had maligned and opposed Paul. We see this. Titus also came to put the collection in order. Paul likely worried that the hurt feelings would diminish the offering. And he feared that these leaders who had kind of come in and infiltrated were kind of setting themselves up. Their demands for financial support was going to diminish the Corinthians' ability to complete what they had promised. And so we find this, it's a very difficult situation. During this time, Paul's situation in Ephesus is difficult. We see this in verses 8 through 10. Our affliction which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened excessively beyond our strength, right? So this is happening here in Ephesus. It becomes perilous. After the riot there, Paul leaves Ephesus for Troas. He hoped to preach the gospel and meet Titus before coming back, but we find that there was an open door for ministry, chapter 2:12. Titus didn't come, so Paul headed for Macedonia, and in Macedonia, Paul engages in ministry. Acts chapter 20, and he organizes collection. Titus finally comes to Paul, finally makes it there. And because he thought this letter might make things worse, he's glad to hear Titus say, no, things are going in a better way. So that's why he says in chapter 7, verses 8 through 10, you were wounded for a while. So they're moving in the right direction. So really through chapters 1 through 9, we're seeing in 2 Corinthians or Corinthians D, back and forth. This is a really strained relationship. If you've had a relationship and you know like your ups and your downs, and especially once you hit a rocky patch, like everything becomes everything, that's kind of what Paul's having to deal with the Corinthians. These people who have come in are just making things worse. They're poisoning the well. It's not very good. But this is, I'll post the outline there on course documents here for 1 Corinthians. There's a lot of things happening there and a lot of things that Paul is addressing. And Paul is addressing a church for which he still cares deeply, even though there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of back and forth during this time. So as we deal with the issues, here's one of the things we have to do. First, 2 Corinthians has its own issues. And the first issue is the issue of opponents. The opponents in Corinth. We have to be careful because the people Paul had to deal with in 1 Corinthians are not the people he's dealing with in 2 Corinthians. The issues Paul is dealing with in 1 Corinthians are primarily about issues and struggles with people inside the church. They already existed there. They lived together. They've been there with Paul, and they've just kind of gotten off course. When we turn to 2 Corinthians, we have people from outside coming in. These would be like these are just unhelpful friends. They're poisoning the well of this relationship. And so they've come in, they divided the church against Paul there. Now, even what's interesting is they seem to have divisions among themselves inside the church, but they just all hate Paul, right? The enemy of the enemy, my enemy is my friend. So that's kind of what we've got with a lot of these guys. They're taking money from the church and they're denigrating Paul's ministry. It's not good in there. 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 does become difficult for us because there's a tone change. Some say, now here's what happens. So if you're in chapter 9, he talks about this, about their giving, and he ends on a pretty fond note. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. Chapter 10, now I, Paul, heard you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I am meek when face to face with you, but bold when toward you when absent. There seems to be something that happened. There's a tone change that's associated with these opponents. One of the things that will happen, there are theories about why would this change happen? Why would chapter 9 in such a conciliatory manner and chapter 10 fire up in a different way? Some have said that chapters 1 through 9 are actually Corinthians D, and that chapters 11 through 13 are actually Corinthians C. That's why we have to have those numbers, or those letters there. That somebody's come in and pulled along chapter 10, pulled apart this other letter and made one new letter. Problem is, again, there is no Greek manuscript that suggests anything except this whole thing circulated as is. Chapter 10 through 13 don't contain anything that would say this was published as its own letter. It just doesn't do there. That doesn't work. There are those who have tried to say that it's been stitched together. Again, if it was, there's not a single shred of evidence about how it came about. It's always there. And there are other problems with those theories, that the documentary theories. But I mean, ultimately, we have to look at it and say there's just no evidence. If you're going to have something, you want evidence. There's none to this. The reality is, though, I think it's possible that there's some time between the completion of chapters 1 through 9 and the additional completion of chapters 10 through 13. It's not a perfect solution, but maybe Paul kind of gets to a point in chapter 9, and what we now know is chapter 9, and he's going to complete the letter. Perhaps he has to leave someplace. Perhaps he has to go someplace. If we don't really know we do know within this time that Paul's moving around a lot. Something is happening here. We're talking somewhere around AD 56. If Paul writes 1 Corinthians and the 1 Corinthians B in AD 55 in the first part of the year, he probably writes Corinthians C sometime around the end of the year, AD 55. And if we're saying somewhere kind of around AD 56, certain things can change in Paul's life pretty quickly. If he's gone into Macedonia and he wrote certain parts and then he's out here and about, and he may be a month. It could have been a couple of weeks. Something could have changed. Those are certainly possibilities for the tone change there. It's not a perfect solution to explain that, but I think it does offer the least problems. Also always associated with those opponents. Like Paul seems to be getting in a good thing, but he may have gotten a fresh report at some point later. So you'll see that sometimes if you dive into 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians. All right, so let's talk about those key themes. One of the biggest ones, it has to do with Paul's opponents. True versus false apostleship. Who are true apostles and who are false apostles? In chapters 4 and chapter 11, Paul highlights this. His apostleship is coming from God. He tells them, my apostleship is not something I did. It is not something I got on myself. It is something that I received from God. He also talks, with his apostleship don't come high status and honor. It often, as he'll come and says, more laborers, more imprisonments, beaten times without number, in danger of death, 5 times receiving 40 lashes minus 1. Like Paul tells us, his apostleship from God, his apostleship mirrors the Savior in the fact that Jesus Christ suffered for us and he's suffering in his apostleship. So there's a big one for Paul there. And mirrors the second big theme here. It's called strength and weakness. You see this particularly in chapter 12. You'll see chapters 11 through 12. His apostleship is a dependence upon God, and he'll even talk about his thorn in the flesh. It's one of those key things. There's a contrast here. For Paul, his confidence was not in who he is and what he's accomplished and all these other things. His confidence is ultimately in God and understanding his own weakness there. That's why he'll say in chapter 4, verse 7, in talking about his ministry, but we have this treasure in earthly vessels so that the surpassing greatness of the power will be of God and not of ourselves. Again, the strength is not in Paul. His strength is God. And Paul is a weak earthen vessel. He's not a big thing. He's not that. So that's a huge theme here for Paul, closely related to this first one. Again, a third one here, this reconciliation. You can tell how this is going to play a theme here, because in some ways the reconciliation that he is exhorting in his ministry is also going to be, he's also pointing to this reconciliation that the Corinthians need to have with him. And so Paul says in chapter 4, he's been given this ministry of reconciliation, ultimately to point out in the gospel that Christ has died for us, that he has made this way for reconciliation with God to occur through his own death, burial, and resurrection. And he highlights this, that it's a work of God. For it is God who said, light shall shine out of darkness, is the one who has shown in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. God is the one who initiates this reconciliation. He comes, He takes us, He speaks into our hearts, not when we were seeking Him, but when He was seeking us. He calls us into this new relationship through faith, calling us out of darkness, not because of who we are, but ultimately in our darkness reaching down. Excuse me. And then finally, there's this issue, this generosity and stewardship. Paul is very clear here. While the emphasis is on God's gracious giving, the Corinthians have been given this gift that they would give. And he encourages them. Paul encourages the Corinthians that he wants them to be faithful, to be generous, but he also gives us some clues about his own understanding of this stewardship. He's not doing this. We saw this as well in 1 Corinthians, that he understands that this is not something, it's for him, that he is ultimately a steward to make sure that things happen there. So he encourages them to generosity. Be generous. Here's what God has given you, therefore give. And that's where he does that key theme well. So you see a rather complex set of issues here with these two letters. We could spend 12, 16 weeks in class going over the intricacies here, but we do see a very interesting kind of way that Paul is really getting us to understand here's what's happening, but also showing the Corinthians, pointing them to Christ, pointing them back to the gospel over and over again in multiple situations, whether it's sexual immorality, the resurrection, unity, false apostleship, their strength. All of these always pointing back to the gospel and grounding this church in the gospel as they deal with, again, issues that evolve and change over time, and doing so in a way that that acknowledges the reality of some of the pain that they're having to go through in this relationship. So, really fascinating correspondence there, and lots of beautiful things to deal with.